The mightiest female sovereign in Europe did not pass with a whisper. She was struck down, abruptly and brutally, within the walls of the Winter Palace. In mere hours, the most colossal disgrace in the annals of monarchy was conceived. On a frigid November morning in 1796, the palace that had beheld insurrections, crowning ceremonies, and beheadings now witnessed something profoundly more disturbing. The last gasp of Catherine the Great and the genesis of falsehood that would endure beyond her grave. Before we proceed, leave a brief comment stating your location. I am keen to observe the vast reach of these narratives. Catherine too lies insensate upon her colossal imperial bed, its velvet canopy hanging over her like a crimson firmament. Merely hours before, she had fallen in a modest privy chamber, her form crumpling upon the marble tiles without a sound. Servants raised her in terror, hastening her through gilt passageways illuminated by flickering candlelight. Now, her breathing is scarcely perceptible. Court medics cluster around her in rigid quiet, their countenances pale and impotent. They recognize there is nothing left to preserve. Catherine's existence, 34 years of expansion, legislation, conflict, statecraft, aspiration, and perpetual activity, is ebbing away in labored, faltering breaths. By sunrise, she will have departed, and almost instantly, something begins to circulate through the palace, through the metropolis, through Russia itself. A tale, a murmur, a venomous seed. It does not speak of her military ventures against the Ottomans. It does not recollect the cultural awakening she ignited. It makes no mention of the institution she founded, the thinkers she engaged with in correspondence, or the realm she fundamentally altered. The world elects to forget all of that. It elects something else, something monstrous. By the time Catherine's form grows cold, domestics are already whispering that her demise was not of natural cause, that an event occurred, something dishonorable, something unutterable. And in the turmoil that invariably follows a sovereign's death, falsehoods outpace truth. The gossip asserts the empress did not perish from an apoplexy. It alleges she died beneath a steed. As the narrative propagates, particulars transform like a contagion. In one telling, she devised a system of ropes and pulleys to hoist a stallion above her. In another, she grew weary of men and sought gratification elsewhere. In every iteration, the conclusion is identical. The tackle fails, and Catherine is pulverized under the mass of her own moral corruption. It is ludicrous. It is implausible. And that is precisely why it flourishes. A disgrace so foul, so theatrical, so mortifying is impossible to resist. It glides from drawing rooms to bazaars, from the parlors of Paris to the halls of Vienna, until the fiction becomes more potent in the public imagination than reality ever was. But if one strips away the malice of the fable, something significant persists. The existence of a woman who instilled dread in her adversaries long before they discovered a method to desecrate her legacy. Catherine was not born to unsettle empires. She was not even born with a legitimate right to anything greater than an inconsequential German station. She came into this world as Sophia Augusta Frederica of Anhalt-Zerbst, a girl destined for a tranquil, obscure life. Yet the machinations of European power have a tendency to draw the peripheral into the eye of the tempest. At 14, she was elected by the Russian court as a prospective consort for the heir to the throne. That heir was Peter, the future Peter III, a boy who would one day reveal himself to be catastrophically incapable of governance. But in 1744, this was unknown. All that was perceived was the prospect of a tactical union. Sophia's father imparted a solitary piece of counsel before her departure. Russia will not bend to you. You must bend to Russia. And she did. The adolescent girl journeyed across a frozen continent, arriving in St. Petersburg with the resolve of one who comprehended this was her sole opportunity to evade oblivion. She adopted the Orthodox faith, assumed the name Catherine, and wed Peter in a magnificent rite intended to signify constancy and concord. But behind the pageantry, the marriage was a gradual catastrophe. Peter was volatile, spiteful, and emotionally immature. He publicly derided Catherine before the assembled court. He dedicated more time to amusing himself with Prussian toy regiments than to attempting to steer an empire. He flaunted paramours in her presence, and for years their union remained unconsummated. A humiliation Catherine bore in profound silence. Every indignity forced her deeper into herself. Every affront honed her comprehension of authority. Every frigid night beside a man who loathed her propelled her nearer to the verity she would ultimately accept. Survival necessitated metamorphosis. And so, Catherine transformed. She mastered the Russian tongue until she spoke it with greater fluency than many aristocrats. She devoured texts by the hundred, histories, political discourses, philosophical volumes, anything that could instruct her in navigating a venomous court. She forged alliances not overtly, but quietly, systematically, constructing bonds Peter was too conceited to perceive. In secrecy, she laid a foundation of sway robust enough to support a throne. Then arrived the instant that overturned everything. Empress Elizabeth perished in 1761, and Peter assumed power. What ensued was a calamity scarcely paralleled in Russian chronicles. Peter estranged the Orthodox Church with brusque Lutheran mandates. He enraged the military by extolling Prussia, the very nation Russia had vanquished after years of carnage. He enforced reforms that affronted every stratum of the nobility. And most grievously, he made plain his intent to dispose of Catherine, by annulment, by banishment, possibly by confinement. He had no notion of how perilous she had grown. For 17 years, Catherine had been readying herself for such a moment. 17 years of observation, study, endurance, and scheming. And in 1762, as Peter blundered toward his own ruin, she moved. Bolstered by the Imperial Guard and the Orlov brothers, one of whom was her paramour, Peter was compelled to renounce the crown. Within days, he was deceased. Catherine seized the throne at 33. A woman devoid of Russian lineage had just usurped the greatest empire in Europe. And that instant, that deed, is the darkness from which every rumor, every hushed tale, every lewd falsehood would ultimately sprout. For certain individuals never pardon a woman for enduring, and they never pardon her for prevailing. Catherine ascended to power as tempests arrive, suddenly, violently, with a fury none could disregard. Once she took the crown, there was no vacillation, no lenient shift, no respite. She governed instantly and with finality, as if her entire life had been a preparation for this solitary juncture. Because it had been. The Russia she obtained was immense but precarious, a vast, glacial creature pieced together from subdued territories, brutal allegiances, and ages of terror. To command it demanded more than mere dominion. It demanded vision. It demanded resolve. It demanded a species of inexorable ambition that few men held, and that virtually no woman was ever permitted to exhibit. Catherine possessed it in full. She commenced by reforming the court itself. The suffocating ceremonies and intellectual sterility of Peter's reign were swept aside. In their place, she cultivated an atmosphere of Enlightenment discourse. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, purchased art collections that became the nucleus of the Hermitage, and drafted vast legal codes aimed at modernizing a feudal state. She invited architects, painters, and thinkers from across Europe, transforming St. Petersburg from a bleak northern fortress into a scintillating capital of culture and power. Yet for all her patronage of the arts and philosophy, Catherine remained, at her core, an autocrat. Her reign was defined by relentless territorial hunger. She waged 2 victorious wars against the Ottoman Empire, securing the Crimean Peninsula and the northern coast of the Black Sea, a long-cherished dream of Russian tsars. She orchestrated the partitions of Poland, erasing a sovereign nation from the map alongside Prussia and Austria, and expanding Russia's borders farther west than ever before. Her personal life became a courtly tapestry of its own, woven with romantic liaisons that were as much political partnerships as they were affairs of the heart. A succession of favorite advisers, Gregory Orlov, Gregory Potemkin, Platon Zubov, each played a role in both governance and intimacy. Potemkin, perhaps the most significant, was not merely a lover but co-ruler in all but name, a brilliant and volatile partner with whom she conquered and administered vast southern territories. These relationships were conducted with discretion and mutual benefit that stood in stark contrast to the vulgar myth that would later engulf her. For over 3 decades, Catherine wielded power with a steel grip masked by enlightened rhetoric. She suppressed peasant revolts, most brutally the Pugachev Rebellion, with horrific severity, affirming that her tolerance for reform ended where threats to her authority began. She ennobled the loyal, enriched the state, and cemented Russia's status as a great power. And then, on that November morning, the motion stopped. The engine of will that had driven an empire fell silent. In the void left by her passing, the whispers began their work. The scandal did not emerge from the Russian people, who largely revered her, but from her enemies abroad, from the salons of Paris, where the French Revolution had bred a contempt for monarchy, and from the courts of rival nations who had been outmaneuvered by a German-born woman for a generation. The myth of the horse was the perfect weapon. It reduced a colossal historical figure to a pornographic punchline. It transformed a lifetime of staggering political achievement into a single, grotesque image of deviance. It ensured that for centuries, the name Catherine the Great would evoke a snicker before it evoked a map of modern Russia. But the architecture of her power remains. The cities she founded, the borders she drew, the institutions she built, they're the true epitaph, written not in whispers, but in stone and territory. The lie may travel the world, but the empire she forged endures, a monument to the woman who dared to seize a crown and, in doing so, invited the world to defile her memory. The intellectual stagnation of prior regimes was swept away. In its stead arrived intellectuals, designers of edifices, thinkers, and men of learning from across the continent. Petersburg, a metropolis of frigid granite and even chillier statecraft, began to radiate a novel quality, intellectual ferment. Catherine consumed these concepts voraciously. The writings of Voltaire, Diderot, and Montesquieu occupied her libraries and her private reflections. She did not merely peruse them. She contested them, corresponded with their authors, and argued their principles across vast distances. For nearly 15 years, she maintained an epistolary dialogue with Voltaire, and in a peculiar manner, he evolved into her public advocate from Paris. He hailed her as a star of the North, championing her persona as a monarch of the Enlightenment. Yet while Europe discoursed on her intellect, Catherine fixed her attention upon a more perilous pursuit, territorial aggrandizement. Russia's frontiers had perpetually been the root of its vulnerability. Overextended, sparsely garrisoned, exposed to adversaries on every flank. Catherine aimed to alter this reality irrevocably. Her military forces advanced like a glacial gale across the Black Sea steppe. She initiated 2 protracted conflicts against the Ottoman Porte, fracturing Turkish dominance in the region and guaranteeing Russia an enduring presence upon the Pontic coast. The Crimean Peninsula was annexed in 1783, transmuting Russia into a maritime power the continent could no longer disregard. To the west, she dismembered the Polish Commonwealth fragment by fragment, partaking in 3 successive partitions that expunged a sovereign state from existence. With each diplomatic stratagem, each compact ratified under the menace of Russian cannon, her domain inflated. The cartography of Europe no longer shifted around her. She was the architect of its new form. Still, Catherine's vision extended farther. She harbored a fantasy of reviving the fallen Byzantine Empire, installing her grandson, Constantine, upon a reconstituted Greek throne. This blueprint, termed the Greek Project, was audacious to the point of apparent lunacy, but Catherine did not conceptualize in modest dimensions. She perceived empires as chessboards, and she intended for Russia to become the paramount piece in the contest. The venture never reached fruition, but the mere endeavor disclosed her fundamental nature, a sovereign who repudiated all constraints, even those imposed by history itself. Within her realm, she pursued a distinct variety of triumph, that of high culture. She amassed artworks with the avidity of a curator, aware she was constructing something perennial. Masterworks from Italy, France, Holland, and beyond were dispatched to St. Petersburg in an unending procession of crates. The horde grew so immense she commissioned a new annex to the palace solely to contain it. This wing became the Hermitage, a testament to a woman determined to transmute Russia into an entity that was cultured, polished, and impossible to dismiss. However, while Catherine erected museums and corresponded with philosophers, the empire beneath her resplendent capital was fracturing. Millions of serfs existed in savage deprivation. Kin were traded like livestock. Peasants were flogged, famished, and driven to collapse under aristocratic masters who wielded near-absolute dominion over them. In 1773, this brittle structure ruptured. Yemelyan Pugachev, a Cossack possessing magnetism and a perilous gift for narrative, rallied multitudes by professing to be Peter III, Catherine's assassinated spouse, resurrected to deliver the subjugated. His insurrection was not a mere border clash. It was a conflagration. Settlement after settlement capitulated. Landowners were butchered. Imperial governance disintegrated across whole provinces. For the first occasion in her reign, Catherine felt the empire quaking underfoot. She retaliated in the sole manner she trusted would preserve both Russia and her own rule. Her armies marched with pitiless exactitude. Pugachev was apprehended, transported to Moscow in an iron cage, and put to death in a public exhibition engineered to paralyze the spirit of revolt in the veins of the onlookers. His adherents were strung up along the highways, their corpses left oscillating in the breeze. The proclamation was unequivocal: fracture Russia, and Russia will shatter you in turn. The rebellion transformed her. Whatever utopian notion she once entertained regarding ameliorating the lot of serfs dissipated. Stability mandated submission, and submission mandated terror. Catherine augmented the nobility's authority over their chattel, fastening the manacles upon an empire already infamous for its cruelty. Duality, enlightenment upon the surface, Pharisee beneath, became the hallmark of her governance. Yet the world seldom censured her for political paradox. It condemned her for something else entirely: her private conduct. Catherine's paramours were not clandestine. They constituted part of her court's cadence. Some were political confederates. Some were emotional sanctuaries. Some were youthful courtiers avid for selection. She recompensed them with honors, estates, and domains. And when the liaison concluded, she ensured they alighted gently, often wed to affluent heiresses or elevated to sinecures. Europe's monarchs had perpetrated far worse for centuries. But Catherine was a woman, and women were not permitted such latitude. Her antagonists seized upon every affiliation. They murmured that she was imprudent, debauched, unquenchable. They depicted her as an empress governed by carnality rather than statecraft, disregarding the fact that many men she favored also assisted her in administering the realm. They ignored the complexity and propagated the caricature. It was less arduous to believe a woman could command an empire with her physique rather than her intellect. The scorn accumulated like thunderheads. Gossip festered in obscurity until something infinitely more malicious was prepared for genesis, a rumor potent enough to outlast her, engineered to disassemble her heritage fragment by fragment. What it would metamorphose into in the vastness of its propagation, none in Catherine's era could have conceived. A falsehood was approaching, one so abominable it would pulverize verity beneath its weight. Catherine the Great's demise ought to have concluded her chronicle. It should have terminated with state interment, a sealed sarcophagus, and a legacy inscribed in the colossal territories she enlarged and the savage rebellion she extinguished. But instead, the instant she perished, something toxic commenced slithering from the fissures of Europe's political landscape. What originated as a murmur burgeoned into the most notorious fabrication in regal annals. Her ultimate hours were banally tragic. On November 16th, 1796, Catherine slumped in her privy chamber, her physique faltering without ceremony. Domestics conveyed her to her bed, where she hovered between respirations until she departed the subsequent dawn. Physicians documented every particular: the chronology, the indications, the apoplexy, the stupor. There were observers. Archives writes, nothing enigmatic, nothing disgraceful. Yet truth seldom endures long within a palace. Her son, Paul, declined to champion her. Their rapport had forever been tense, envenomed by distrust, bitterness, and the conviction that Catherine had purloined both his father's diadem and his father's existence. Whether Paul genuinely believed she had contrived Peter III's murder or merely required a scapegoat, he made no endeavor to shield her repute. He did not even attempt to arrest what ensued. And what ensued was conceived in the salons of Europe, not in Russia. France, in the delirious turmoil of revolution, despised Catherine for her antagonism toward their cause. Conservative courts, while fearing the revolutionary contagion, nonetheless relished an opportunity to defame a formidable female autocrat who had consistently bested them in diplomacy and war. The myth germinated in this fertile soil of resentment, jealousy, and profound misogyny, taking root not among her subjects, but among her rivals, those she had spent a lifetime outmaneuvering, who could now only defeat her in the realm of posthumous slander. Conservative monarchies resented her innovations and supremacy. Religious traditionalists abhorred her enlightened principles. A legion of vanquished opponents, foreign envoys, expatriated aristocrats, thwarted plotters, harbored grievances keen enough to slice. They could no longer confront her legions. They could not reverse her triumphs. Yet they could execute something infinitely more ruinous, annihilate her legacy. Initially, the whispers were elementary, the customary assaults directed at formidable women. She was excessively partial to youthful consorts. She gratified her appetites. She comported herself in a manner no lady of standing ought to. But common defamation proved insufficient. Catherine was too colossal a persona. To diminish her, the falsehood required a grotesquerie potent enough to eclipse her entire existence. And thus, the ultimate monstrous fabrication surfaced, meticulous in its barbarity, impeccable in its degradation. It alleged she perished whilst engaged in congress with Stallion. A system of ropes and pulleys, a suspended equine, a fractured tackle, a sovereign crushed. The narrative was preposterous, a physical and biological impossibility. Yet none of this signified. What signified was its indelible nature. The rumor required no evidence. It demanded imagination. It demanded outrage. It demanded to wound more profoundly than any political censure ever could. Within months, the anecdote disseminated across the continent, murmured behind fans at aristocratic suppers, whispered in public houses, reiterated with rapturous revulsion in thoroughfares and drawing rooms. By the early 1800s, it had become diver, adhere, particularly when they compress an intricate individual into an entity the world finds more convenient to ridicule than to comprehend. Catherine the Great merited a heritage constructed upon her attainments. Instead, she was bequeathed a heritage erected upon another's fancy. Still, herein lies the element her foes never foresaw. When one exhumes a veracity beneath the gossip, Catherine emerges more daunting still, not because she was flawless, far from it, but because she was authentic. She was luminous and merciless, empathetic and scheming, reformist and tyrannical, a ruler so exceptional that the world was compelled to invent a myth sufficiently vile to eclipse her actuality. But her authentic chronicle, the one inscribed in blood, ink, stone, and soil, refuses interment. History recollects Catherine the Great not on account of falsehood, but because the falsehood could never entirely encompass the woman who instigated it. And ultimately, the sole entity genuinely pulverized beneath the mass of the rumor was the reality of her genuine peril.